So I'm Jack Gibbons. I'm with the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, which was established in 1997, almost 15 years ago. And we're a coalition of about 90 organizations that represent over 6 million Ontarians. And our first goal was to achieve a coal phase-out, and our long-term goal is to move Ontario towards a 100% renewable electricity grid. Now, when we started back in 1997 and we were focused on the coal phase-out, you know, all the energy insiders, all the people who consider themselves to be politically sophisticated, I mean, they said, you know, Jack, you're never going to achieve this goal. I mean, you're just a Don Quixote. I mean, back then, coal provided us with 25% of our electricity. It was cheap, and Mike Harris was Premier of Ontario. And people said, you know, Mike Harris, he doesn't care about the environment, he'll never phase out coal. Well, we started in 1997. 4 years later, Mike Harris, as Minister of the Environment, Elizabeth Whitmer, issued a legally binding regulation requiring coal burning at the Lakeview coal plant in Mississauga to cease in April 2005. And you know what? That regulation was obeyed. Coal burning stopped in April 2005 at Lakeview, the #1 air polluter in the whole GTA. And now that whole Lakeview coal-fired power plant is being knocked down. It doesn't exist anymore. 4 years after we started. 5 years after we started in 2002, Ernie Eves, the Ernie Eves government, a Tory Premier of Ontario, committed this great province to phase out all of our coal plants by 2015. We achieved that 5 years after we started. So when people tell you that a small group of activists can't change the world, they're just not telling you the truth. It's amazing what you can do if you're focused, if you're promoting a goal that's clearly in the public interest and you've got pragmatic solutions. And now it's 2012, and we've just about got the coal phase out. Coal-fired production last year was at its lowest level in this great province in 50 years. Only 2.7% of our electricity came from coal. We've now got legally binding regulations that require all the coal plants to shut down in 2 years from now. So we're making great progress. And so now we're focused on our long-term goal, 100% renewable electricity grid by 2030. And by 100% renewable grid, we mean that all the electricity that comes to your home or your office or your factory from an electricity wire, all of that comes from renewable sources. Now that's just 12 years from now. And again, the smart people, the sophisticated people may say, well, you're dreaming, it can't be done. And there's a lot of reasons to think why they might be right. Last year, how much of our electricity did we get from nuclear? Anyone know?
About 50%.
50%? Any other numbers?
55.
Pardon?
55.
55? Any others? Pardon?
I think it's less.
I wish you were true. It's 57%. Last year, 7% of our electricity came from nuclear. And not only, so that's one discouraging fact to many people. Another discouraging fact is Premier McGuinty is committed to a massive nuclear rebuild plan. He wants to rebuild 4 nuclear reactors at the Bruce. He wants to rebuild 4 nuclear reactors at Darlington. He wants to build 2 brand new nuclear reactors at Darlington. He says it will cost like a mere $30 billion, but we know from past experience it's more likely to cost $80 billion. So here's the Premier of Ontario committed to this massive reinvestment in nuclear, which if it occurs will lock us into nuclear for more than 60 years. So that's discouraging. Also, what are the 2 biggest power companies in Ontario? Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power. Combined, they produce more than 80% of our electricity. And both of them are rabidly pro-nuclear. I mean, they're in that business. And, nuclear power has relatively low greenhouse gas emissions. And many environmentalists, including me, say that, climate change is one of the most serious threats to mankind. But nevertheless, I'm supremely confident that we can phase out nuclear in the next 18 years and move to a 100% renewable grid. And I'm confident, and we've never been in a stronger position. And I started in this business in 1979. It was after the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in 1979 that I decided to join the environmental movement to fight nuclear power. And that was over 30 years ago. And back then, I mean, people knew that there was huge risks with nuclear, huge safety risks, but they were willing to accept it because they believed that nuclear power was cheap, and they believed that the only alternative was dirty coal. So back then, it was the conventional wisdom that, nuclear was the way to go. We should have massive reinvestments in nuclear. But you know what? The good news is now virtually no one believes that nuclear is cheap. I mean, the nuclear track record in terms of cost around the world in Ontario was absolutely outrageous. Every single nuclear project in Ontario's history has gone massively over budget, on average by a factor of 2.5 times. So it's not cheap. And over the last 3 years, Angela and I, the Clean Air Alliance, and you, our helpers, our supporters, have got this message out right across Ontario. That nuclear is not cheap, that there's been these huge cost overruns, and you know what? Everyone believes it now. Virtually everyone you've talked to believes it. You talk to the Queen's Park media, they all think nuclear is hugely expensive. Angela and I met an Ontario cabinet minister last week, and he told us, he said, Jack and Angela, all my cabinet colleagues have heard you. They all know nuclear is not cheap, it's very expensive. So people don't believe nuclear is cheap anymore, which they did 30 years ago when I started in this business. And the other really good news is now that it's absolutely clear that there are lots of lower cost, safer, and cleaner options. And that's what we're promoting. We're promoting 3 much lower cost, much cleaner and safer options to phase out the nukes in the next 18 years. And they are energy efficiency, water power imports from Quebec, and combined heat and power. Now let's just talk about energy efficiency first. And we are making good progress. When I started out 30 years ago, the prediction was the demand for electricity would grow relentlessly forever. And so it was really hard to imagine, how we could ever move to a renewable grid. But since 2005, the electricity consumption in Ontario has actually fallen by 10%. Fallen by 10%. Nevertheless, our electricity consumption per person is still 35% higher than that of New York State. So there's still a lot we can do to become much more energy efficient and reduce our bills. So energy efficiency is the key thing. It's the best solution. And in terms of renewables, the lowest cost renewable option for Ontario by far is water power imports from Quebec. The people in the United States are much smarter than we are. A couple of years ago, Vermont signed a 26-year deal with Hydro-Quebec to import water power for 26 years at a price of 5.8 cents a kilowatt hour. That's less than 1/3 the cost of new nuclear. That's a really good bargain. And I just want to make clear that we are not advocating new dams in Quebec. There's all kinds of problems with that. But at the moment, Hydro-Quebec is exporting 11% of its power. Most of it to the United States. We want to get a lot of that power coming to Ontario instead. Focus on what's best for Ontario, what's best for Canada. But also there's a lot more that Quebec can do to increase its power exports without building dams. Our electricity consumption, I told you, was 35% higher than New York State, so we're very wasteful in our use of electricity. But Quebec is much, much more wasteful than we are. Quebec's electricity consumption per person is double that of Ontario's. Double that of Ontario's. It's just absurd. And so if Quebec was smart, they would invest in energy efficiency, lower their domestic customers' bills, free up their existing heritage hydroelectric capacity, and export that power to Ontario and the United States to make a huge profit and give us a clean source of power. So that's what we're advocating. And that can make a huge contribution to moving us to a renewable grid and lowering our bills. What could be better? And the third option is stop wasting natural gas. Now, we all know that eventually we want to get to a 100% renewable energy system. But we can't get there overnight. And so we think natural gas is a good transition fuel because it's the cleanest fossil fuel. But if we are going to use natural gas, we've got to use it as efficiently as possible. And so we've got this crazy situation in Ontario where virtually every building and every factory uses natural gas, but they just use it for one service, heating. And it's much more efficient to use the same molecules of gas to simultaneously produce heat and electricity, and that's what combined heat and power plants do. And that's what we should be doing here in Ontario too. They do it in Western Europe, they do it in Japan, and it just makes economic sense, it makes environmental sense. and it's politically acceptable. You know, they proposed a number of large gas-fired power plants in Mississauga and Oakville. They've been cancelled because of political opposition. And those power plants would only be 50% energy efficient. 50% of the gas would be simply wasted. Combined heat and power, they're 80 to 90% efficient, much more efficient, therefore lower cost. They're small scale, and therefore there's never been any political opposition to them. I mean, people don't even know where these combined heat and power plants exist. I mean, how many of you know where the nearest combined heat and power plant is to this room? Anyone?
There's one at U of T, that's what I know.
Yeah, well, that's great. You're right. That's the closest one here, and that's a great one. It keeps the lights on the U of T, and the heat through underground steam tunnels heats about 80 buildings. But like when I was a student at U of T, I didn't know about it. And you know, most students don't know about it. So that's just one example. There's also one up at the David Kroll Seniors Residence on Bloor and Huron. There's one at the Pearson Airport. Numerous hospitals have them. But we want to create 1,000 points of light across Ontario by converting our buildings, our apartment buildings, our condos, shopping center, recreation centers, factories, airports into small-scale power plants. So this is a thing. People now know nuclear is expensive, and we do know that there are lower-cost, cleaner, and safer alternatives. So that's one of those are reasons why I'm really optimistic. Also, of course, the NDP and the Green Party are both firmly opposed to nuclear. Now, our friend Premier McGuinty and Tim Hudak, they say they're very pro-nuclear. But if you listen to them carefully, what they are for is low-cost nuclear. They have never said they are for high-cost nuclear. And this is how we're going to eventually get them on our side. So that's important. And so now there's this really, and in the last provincial election, there was this huge issue about rising electricity bills. That was a huge issue. People were mad about rising electricity bills. So this is a tremendous opportunity for a politician who can come forward with a clean and green future at a reasonable cost. And this is the tremendous opportunity for our new energy minister, Chris Bentley, who's a smart guy from London, by abandoning nuclear and focusing on energy efficiency, water power from Quebec, and combined heat and power, stop wasting natural gas. He can provide us with a clean and green future. He can lower our electricity bills and be a political and economic hero for this province. So that's our opportunity. And we've got a pamphlet trying to persuade him to do that. So that's basically, you know, our view. So now what we've got is a 6-point plan for the Government of Ontario to move to this clean and green energy future. The first point is to put the coal plants on standby reserve. Only operate them between now and 2014 if they're absolutely needed to keep the lights on, which will be virtually never. And it's important in this context to remember that the coal plants are no longer profitable. Since January 2009, the Ontario Power Generation has lost $929 million operating the coal plants. So let's basically shut them down now, put them on standby reserve, only operate them if they are absolutely needed, which will be virtually never. The second point is really focus on energy conservation. Energy conservation is a great way to go. Problem is a lot of people, a lot of businesses don't know what the best technologies are, how to do it, or they don't have the capital to do it. And this is where our electric utilities like Toronto Hydro or London Hydro or Horizons Utilities can do a great job at helping people conserve and lowering their bills. We've got this terrible situation, though, where the Ontario Energy Board that regulates them has created all this incredible red tape to discourage the electric utilities from actually doing conservation. And so that's got to change. So Minister Bentley's got to remove this red tape, unshackle the electric utilities so they can help you. In California, which is what got the most energy efficient jurisdiction in North America, the electric utilities have a huge role. They do a great job. In terms of energy conservation, another thing is, like there's this Ontario Power Authority that buys, pays electricity generators to produce electricity. And they pay the electricity generators the full cost, which of course they should. But when it comes to energy conservation, the amount they'll pay an industrial customer to save a kilowatt hour is only a small fraction of what they pay electricity generators to produce a kilowatt hour. And that makes no sense. We should pay the same amount to save a kilowatt hour that we're paying to produce a new kilowatt hour. And so that's another thing that the Minister Bentley's got to do. He's got to get the OPA by the scruff of the neck and demand that they pay the same amount to save a kilowatt hour that they're paying generators to produce it. So those are two key things for conservation. Those are our first 3 points. The fourth point, of course, is that the Ontario Power Authority should negotiate a long-term contract with Hydro-Quebec for clean water power at low cost. Fifth point is we should stop wasting natural gas. All the new gas-fired power plants should be these small-scale combined heat and power plants. And the sixth point is we've got to create a level playing field. Now, the only reason these nuclear power plants got approved in the past was that the nuclear power companies would lowball their cost estimates. They'll come and tell the politician that nuclear power will be really cheap. The politician will get suckered in, sign the contract. Then the nuclear power company would have huge cost overruns, and they'd be allowed to pass them on to you and me. Now, no gas-fired power company is allowed to pass their cost overruns on to you, me. No renewable company, a wind company, a solar company, a bioenergy company, none of them are allowed to pass their cost overruns on to you and me. But there's this special treatment for nuclear, and that's got to end. We've got to create a level playing field where nuclear isn't allowed to pass their cost overruns. And you know what will happen if that happens? Well, then the nuclear power companies won't lowball their cost estimates anymore. They'll give an honest priced estimate so they can be assured of recovering their profits and not going, or costs and not going bankrupt. But when they do that, they'll have to give an honest price bid, which will be so high that it will be clear to even the stupidest politician that nuclear isn't economic. So that's our 6-point plan to solve Ontario's energy problems. And the only problem is, so what our 6-point plan we think is highly irrational. It makes economic sense. But when you're up against a very powerful special interest group, what the nuclear energy industry is, you can't win just by being logical and by having good, rational arguments. You also need political pressure. And that's where we need your help. And Angela will talk to you about that.